for the first time in my life, I had seen an adversarial military that was more military capable in the Arctic specifically than we were. And China has zero experience with this. They don't know how to even understand this. And we practice this on a daily basis in the United States. It's kept everyone awake at night, current and former commanders at NORAD, NORTHCOM. So, because the Arctic is still the shortest avenue of approach to attack North America, the solutions just naturally came pouring out in terms of, all right, satellites, and they don't work here. Lasers don't work here either, right? There's just a lot of problems here in the north and the higher latitudes that prevent those sort of conventional solutions from being options.
Dr. Bouffard, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's start our discussion by going back to sort of geography 101, if you will, because I think it's really important here. And here's a simple but serious question, Dr. Bouffard.
Mm.
Where's the Arctic?
Yeah.
I mean, on the globe, I can turn it upside down and show, this is Antarctica. But it's really hard to do that with the Arctic, right?
Yeah, it's quite the literally the polar opposite of the South Pole.
Yeah.
Antarctica. Antarctica, you have a landmass surrounded by water. In the Arctic, you have water surrounded by sovereign land masses, which is why everything is different. The definitions of the Arctic vary. What is the Arctic? Where is the Arctic?
They vary. Interesting. Okay.
They do. You have several established definitions of the Arctic, and these can be really important based on context, and laws, and other applications. Several ecological definitions, some based on the July 10 degrees Celsius mean isotherm. The vegetation boundaries. So in the north, we're seeing vegetation slowly move north, and that affects flora and fauna, tree line kind of thing. And you have several political definitions also, which are important also. So each nation has its own definition of the Arctic. For the United States, it's based off the 1984 Arctic Research Act, which uses the Arctic Circle up to Alaska, where it dips down to the Porcupine, picks up the Yukon River, picks up the Kuskokwim River, and then follows along the Aleutian chain and back up to the Arctic Circle. So that's the ARPA Act, and that's our official U.S. code definition of the Arctic.
But based on what you just shared with us, that comes down south quite a bit.
Yes, but not. It doesn't get to Fairbanks, right? Because the Yukon River, and by the time it gets to the Aleutians, there's a smaller population. We can estimate what that is, and we've done that. There's also geographic definitions too. The Arctic Circle itself.
Okay. So you mentioned the United States ARPA. The 1984 Arctic Research Act, and you said there are political definitions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into the politics of this. What countries are in the Arctic? U.S. is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we have the U.S., Canada, Greenland via Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Well, these are the Arctic 8 that are commonly referred to, the Arctic nations that are established as Arctic nations with territory, maritime and terrestrial, either in the Arctic, and they're known as the Arctic 8.
Now, correct my geography here, Dr. Bouffard, if I'm wrong. Sweden and Finland don't have an Arctic Ocean coast.
Correct.
They'd have to go through the Baltic and through the Straits. I don't know what it's called through,
Yeah, correct.
Copenhagen, Denmark, but yet they have claim to
Mhm.
the Arctic as a country.
Yeah,
Huh.
simply because they're above the Arctic Circle, but like you just mentioned, they don't have any maritime boundaries in the
Yeah.
Arctic that become very important in terms of sovereignty. And sovereignty can be often the leading priority of most strategies of any nation. So we have the Arctic Five, which do have that kind of maritime boundary that extends into international waters as part of a lot of what we see in terms of competition, right? So, and then the Arctic Three, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, just like you said, don't. And that changes things. So the Arctic Five have the sovereignty basis, which can really lead discussions and importance of issues in a room and decision making. And the Arctic Three, who don't quite have that part of that important issue to bring into a fight or a competition,
Yeah.
so they lean on other things to be important, to be inclusive, to bring value to the what the Arctic region is working on, like with the Arctic Council and whatnot. So, and that's often multinationalism efforts, and Iceland is a really good example of this.
Mhm.
They know they're in a key location in the Arctic. If you look at any map, you'll notice there's two ways in and out of the Arctic. And Iceland is right in the middle of one of those, and they've taken full advantage of realizing they can be a major hub on that end of the Arctic, and realizing they don't quite have the power and influence that sovereignty issues bring. They've taken full advantage of it. They've created one of the biggest Arctic annual events, and beyond that, they're in a key geographic location for many civil and military purposes.
Sort of like a hub, have ports,
Yep,
refueling, and commerce, and all sorts of things. That's
everything.
really interesting. Now, when you talked about the Arctic Five, is Denmark one of those via Greenland?
Yep.
Yeah. Um, what countries? I'm a little hesitant as to the use of words here. I'll just say it. What countries lay claim to the Arctic? I'm not even sure what that word would mean, lay claim. Do you like stake a flag in the bottom of the ocean? How does that work?
The Arctic Eight, of course, have traditionally and continue to be the Arctic Eight nations that everyone refers to, and that's sort of our normal business. But other actors, most prominently China, are trying to gain access to our Arctic affairs. So they've become, and
China
as
from way down there?
and they've called themselves in their 2018 white paper policy. They referred to themselves as a near Arctic state, and
Wow.
that did not work out very well for them at all. They don't refer to themselves as that much anymore. The West kind of likes to poke at them here and there, but China's number one goal, as far as interest in the Arctic, is to gain access and influence to Arctic affairs. So, in doing so, it's it's sort of using strategies to achieve this. And the first strategy they tried to employ to achieve this was to kind of use brute force policy and rhetoric. And in 2014, up to their white paper, they started testing different language, and they floated the idea of near Arctic state. Didn't land too well, but they still put it in their policy. And all of this kind of just, it ended up not working very well for them. So they shifted over to phase two, which is try to entrench themselves economically, like they do all over the world. And most notably, they tried to transfer their Pacific and Africa strategies into the Arctic, and it failed miserably also.
You mean like lend to other sovereign entities and let them
Yeah,
develop things with Chinese money? Is that?
a bit, yeah. Their strategy in the Pacific and especially in Africa was to engage and apply for major economic projects or to present opportunities in developing nations. And that worked very well, continues to work very well elsewhere in the world. When they tried to do that in the Arctic, it really failed badly because they rely on one thing to be very successful in those circumstances.
Which
And
is,
their major aspect of that part of the strategy is to bring in their own workforce. And with
hmm.
that, they can provide, an application or proposals to major projects that no one else can really compete with. So in doing so in the Arctic, it really fell flat because they did not understand and didn't realize that we have somewhat difficult relations, each state with our own indigenous peoples of the Arctic, but we still have good relations that's very inclusive, and it continues to improve, which means you're not bringing in a foreign workforce into an area that already has people that need work, want work. And that just defeated every attempt by China to get into from Finland all the way over to Canada and even the United States. It just did not work.
Oh, that is fascinating. Where, let's say, they could build, let's say, a port in
Yep.
Djibouti or in Pakistan. Actually, they've done that, and you don't have the expertise or manpower. You bring Chinese workforce, but here you are in the Arctic. You have Russians and you have us Americans. You have Canadians who already know how to do this, and plus they're ready to work. So that's going to backfire.
Yep. So that really backfired.
Huh.
And they kind of admit so in closed, settings, and they've gone back to study this. They've admitted they didn't realize that indigenous peoples, were in the north and in the kind of relationship that existed. So, except for Russia, the rest of the Arctic nations were like, "You're not welcome here."
Yeah. And also, they probably didn't appreciate the relationship of indigenous peoples, let's say in Canada and the US,
Yep.
to the governments and states versus their own indigenous people, where they can just tell them to keep quiet. We do what we want in your territory. That's not how it works in the West and North America in particular. So, let me ask you this, Dr. Buffard. Didn't China recently send some ships with Russia, just sort of, I don't know if it was a military drill or was a commercial slash. Could you talk about that, please?
Last year at the end of the summer season, in the Bering Sea,
So
Russia,
ice, there's less ice.
yeah, well, for sure, it's
Okay.
the height. It's each year annually. That's when there's the least amount of sea ice.
So we're talking late August, early September.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Russia and China, and China trying to gain more opportunities to partner with Russia to do these kinds of these operations, had floated two state vessels. I think they were Coast Guard, maybe a mix of naval, but they were state vessels and sailing through the Bering Sea. And that caught our attention because we hadn't seen that before. It also was a little more aggressive than previous years. And
What
there
do you
was a,
mean by aggressive? Were they close to our waters?
it was more deliberate in terms of, of a show of capabilities. And
Hmm.
this was had us, a few of us, really concerned because we were seeing something that was probably changing the nature of how Russia and or China had behaved before. So the first thing to understand about when you're just sailing through waters like that with state vessels is those vessels, whether you're in the maritime environment or you're in the air, you're collecting. What's known as ISR. It's a
What does that
101.
mean?
It means that these usually dual use vessels or aircraft are flying in international waters or airspace and sailing in international waters and completely legal to international law. They're collecting. They're using ISR instruments to collect information about our capabilities in various ways. So ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
Hmm.
And all nations do this. If you're
Okay.
they're out sailing in state vessels. It's expected, it's legal. But we haven't really seen China and Russia doing this before. And the big concern about that, not only that, is one, you have to intervene. You have to intercept and intervene to chase that off, right? That's one of the things that put us in a different place in the Arctic because we have been screaming about the need for presence in the Arctic. If you're going to deal with an issue, you have to be there,
Yeah.
right? You have to be there on the surface, and we were seeing a really huge lack of surface presence and capabilities. So that last summer, that really triggered how how important that is, and a tangible example of like here are several ships, adversaries partnered up coming through the Bering Sea, and they can continue to do so until they're chased off. So this is how this works. We're really good at doing this in the airspace, which Russia has tested for decades in terms of coming into our air defense identification zone here in Alaska.
Hmm.
And it's that buffer zone before sovereign airspace. And our forces down in Anchorage under Alaska NORAD region are able to intercept and intervene and chase them off each time. It's very routine, and at this point, it's actually very valuable training because it's real world without any risk. And we get to often partner with Canada if they fly north and east enough to do so. So we're used to that. However, last year also they brought a Chinese bomber with them for the first time also. So we saw a change there.
Oh,
Where,
wow.
yeah, it was quite, and that was expected. Commander NORAD Northcom had expected that and said so in congressional testimony. So that's to be expected. However, when we're dealing with Russia, especially in the airspace and those kind of circumstances, it's quite routine. It's valuable exercise and training, but we know what to expect. And we're comfortable with that to a limit with Russia because that nothing will go wrong. However, with China, we have no such confidence. And they're trying to get into this kind of activity also.
And for our discussion, for the record of our discussion, China has exhibited aggressive, I don't know the military terms here, Dr. Bouffard, sort of flyby our aircrafts down by the Sea of Japan, China Sea, and others, but close to their sovereign territories, right? So there's a record of that already.
There is, in China's naval forces have typically been brown water, so they've been restricted to coastal operations.
Mhm.
And for a decade plus now, they have been working hard to develop a blue water Navy
It's deeper
capability,
water.
deeper, more sustained out for distance and time.
Yeah.
So, and that's
When,
working. So obviously, we're seeing how some of that works in the South China Sea, which is probably the most contested maritime zone in the world right now.
Yeah. And then what's in it for the Chinese is future shipping lanes and also all the resources that may open up in the Arctic region. Um, Dr. Buffard, you said this several times. What does it mean to chase them off? We essentially have our aircraft just follow them. We're not engaging in any skirmishes or anything here, right?
Part of the efforts of doing that, especially in the airspace, is to test our response capabilities. And we'll never really present those at the foremost capabilities of those aircraft because that's classified, but they'll intercept nonetheless. And it's a constant when you do it over and over and over again, you may learn things from trends and patterns in
Yeah.
terms of and how an adversary or competitor might respond. But the fact remains, unless you chase it off, you start to limit your options on how to deal with the situation if it's really dangerous. But
Yeah,
first,
yeah.
intercepting and chasing it off is pretty routine.
Uh-huh.
We've done that for decades in the air. It's just in the maritime space that's new. And what was concerning about last year is we know that Russia understands that we have limited surface presence capabilities in the Arctic. And we knew if Russia wanted to, they could constantly be in the Bering Sea and really poking around and causing problems and revealing and embarrassing almost the United States' ability to be there to chase off those ships. But I'm confident they specifically didn't do that because they wanted to prevent Washington, D.C. from going into spending circumstances to take care of this issue. I think they rather,
Oh, Russia didn't poke us because they didn't want us sort of awaken a sleeping giant saying, okay, now that you're, really becoming aggressive in the Arctic region, we're going to spend all this money and build assets,
right,
military security assets.
right,
Oh, that is fascinating. So Russia was cognizant of that potential reaction
exactly.
by the US versus China may not really.
China's so new to this that they're just happy to tag along with Russia just to learn. And
Mhm.
they're obviously always trying to steal IP, so they'll do anything to partner with Russia to learn whatever they can, mostly because, and I have an article coming out on this, because if you think about it, China right now has a gap of 2 generations of its entire military and population with zero operational experience on the planet. And in the military culture and what that means through all commands and ranks is that's pretty devastating. I've seen this before, others have, and when you don't have that brutally important experience to help guide how to develop a military, why and how and train, what are you left with? You're left with egos and personality and politics sort of shaping and pushing things in terms of a developing military. So China is not been tested or has any operational experience in contemporary times, right? Since the late 70s when they lost to Vietnam, which means they don't know how this works. They think they do, and they have it on paper, and they have all some of this technology, first gen or whatever, but they've never used it ever. And that's pretty devastating. So when you when you wrap your head around that a bit and understand, that they're working hard to overcome some of this, they also are desperate to be part of anything that helps them at all close some of these really concerning gaps.
Okay, I want to follow up with a question and also a summary to make sure I understand. You made some really important points. First of all, the question that I have is to sort of confirm when you say they have a gap of 2 or 3 generations here. I added the three. You said 2 generations. You're talking about sort of officers and higher echelons of military command that haven't been in war in China since the night, like a serious war. They don't have any. Versus we've been in Afghanistan, we've been in Iraq, we've been just a series of stuff. We we have the technology, but we also have the personnel to know when to use it. The
Oh no,
second part of was I correct on that, Dr. Bouffard? Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. The second part was devastating. Uh, I as you used this word a couple of times, and I was thinking about it. Is this sort of devastate a double-edged sword, devastating to them and also devastating to us, devastating to them because they don't have the experience, but also devastating to us Americans because they may all of a sudden become trigger happy because of lack of experience, because of like macho and bravado. Am I close to the mark on that?
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what has to happen. You got to think about
Wow.
China knows this. So what are they doing? Why are they developing the way they are? We know, and they know they can get toe to toe with us in military confrontation, or NATO or U.S. unilaterally. So what can they do?
I'm sorry, they can or cannot go toe to
Cannot.
toe with us.
They absolutely cannot. They don't.
They
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 don't
cannot. Okay.
know. They don't know how to conduct warfare. They have no experience. They're
Wow.
very vertically strict on their chain of command. And and they do not know how to use information or what the resulting intelligence that comes with that and can guide a battle critically. They don't know any
Wow.
of this. They have no experience or appreciation for this. So that can translate into real world. Yeah, you may have your offense operation all nicely planned on a piece of paper and defense there. That's not what wins battles. It's counter offense and counter defense and what happens when you adapt. And whoever can adapt fastest and most lethally, that's who's going to win. And China has zero experience with this. They don't know how to even understand this, and we practice this on a daily basis in the United States. We appreciate how difficult it can be, from paper to reality. And we're very aware of that. And we work hard to instill that into our doctrine, our thinking, our training, our education, and definitely exercises. So China has no appreciation for this. So the magnitude of what this means is, we could have probably a dozen podcasts and only scratch the surface on something like this. So
Wow.
what they can do, though, and your question got right to this point, is knowing this, realizing they have limitations, but they have global objectives and they have a lot of military resources and presence. What can they do? They can cause a lot of problems. And what's the most important thing for China in situations like this, and somewhat including Russia, but especially China, knowing it can't go toe to toe, is to get the adversary or competitor to make a mistake. So it opens the door for them to be able to punish and cause the international community to really not have an answer. So they have enough capacity to run around this world and plan and try to execute their behavior and conduct and get their competitors to make a mistake, because that's when we get punished. It opens
Hmm.
the door, it changes the nature. If like they try to do something against us under normal circumstances, well, the response would be very severe.
So let me follow up on that with two more questions,
Sure.
Dr. Bouffard. One is that, and I think you answered this question, China understands that it doesn't understand modern warfare. It's not proficient in how to do it. It's cognizant of that deficiency.
Mostly Xi Jinping. I've been following him closely. He gets it.
He gets it.
Yes.
The very
Not
top.
not so much with his senior command though. And you got to realize you have your theater commanders and you have your political commanders
Yeah.
right there, and that's where things start to fall apart because they don't understand. There's still competition, there's egos, there's personalities trying to drive how things work. But I've watched Xi Jinping really closely. He does get it. He is very concerned that the PLA and the Chinese military aren't stepping up and developing in a way that can compete globally.
Oh, wow.
There, there,
So,
there's been some notable moves
so
as of
in a
late.
way, he's kind of keeping the lid and from preventing its military from doing something rash or brash to sort of cause an issue. Um, the second question I have is this: you used the word mistake,
Yeah.
and I communicated with you about this before the
Mhm.
podcast. To what I, a complete non-expert, I don't even, I told you I learned this from the Wall Street Journal. I don't even read military papers or anything. What I see to be a mistake on our part, and this goes back 15, 20 years ago since I've been reading just regular journals like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's a mistake that we don't have enough Arctic sort of resources, military resources. Could you talk about that, please?
So our ability to be present and de-escalate a situation, respond to a situation, is starting to cause us problems,
Hmm.
and that surface presence is really concerning. At the same time, we've been struggling to kind of develop the U.S. military, especially the U.S. Army, in terms of what doctrinally is needed.
Nocturnally. Okay.
So, and this continues to be a traditional problem we've had in the Arctic, which is kind of a good problem to have, which is it doesn't matter what sector it is, economic, it could be military, it's scientific, it's whatever. We can't point to a threat in the Arctic over an Arctic issue. It doesn't exist. Yeah, and it
I
could
didn't follow that sentence. Could you repeat that? We can't point to a threat in the Arctic because it
over
doesn't exist
over an Arctic issue.
over an Arctic issue. What does
So
that
right
mean? What do you
now,
mean by
it
that?
means the region is relatively stable. We just don't have a crisis or anything in the Arctic that's happening right now. If something's going to happen, it's gonna it's going to transfer from outside the Arctic into the Arctic, and those are the scenarios we see as more realistic.
I see.
Conflict
I see.
exists, gray zone and hybrid, conflict is sort of there. Those
What you mean by that is that it's not like the Middle East or Ukraine or Taiwan that it's just like flashing, issue, crisis, crisis. It's sort of a quiet zone for all intents and purposes. Okay, I see.
And that has created circumstances for the entire Arctic region, for all of us. Good ones, though, right? We're not dealing with crises and conflicts. That's a good thing. However, when you start to ask your decision makers and elected and appointed leaders to spend time, money, and effort on something, it's always proactive, and that doesn't sell well, right? When those same people are crushed by things that are happening right now in front of us that do need the time, money, and effort. So everything we do in the Arctic, and has been for years and years and years, has been based off of a proactive approach. When it comes to begging for policy and resources, those are very difficult circumstances to work with, but they're the preferred.
So when our U.S. military and planners go to Congress and say we need X billion dollars for new polar ice cutters, and they say, why? Well, for the future in the next 10, 15 years, or even 5 years, we need this. They're like, I got fires right now in other departments, so I'm not going to give you that money. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. How how behind are we, militarily speaking, in the Arctic?
We were, right before Ukraine invasion, full invasion happened in February 22. 2022. We were behind in a way that was concerning, that caught my attention, and became kind of the way I pitched and explained things to people, in that for the first time in my life, I had seen an adversarial military that was more military capable in the Arctic, specifically, than we were.
Are you're referring to Russia?
It was the first time I'd ever seen that Russia had actually surpassed the United States in a
Wow.
couple of very notable ways. Just
Notable ways. Okay.
well, when they had, and the way that worked was, it's not only the fact that the Northern Fleet was a full, leading military entity of Russia, and capable of operating in the Arctic. It was also that they had taken notable steps beyond bastion and coastal defense to start developing, right, homeland defense militaries. Advanced militaries of the world are generally working in two modes. You're either in defense mode of your homeland, or you're in a force projection development, right? And we uh, we were starting to lag behind because Russia started to develop, with two brigades dedicated to the Arctic, a force projection capability that we didn't have.
Hmm.
So it had, a robust defense, that has been, part of the Cold War and on, uh, and that's known, but they can't project, right? They can't project force and power. Russia changed that, and those brigades stood up and they started demonstrating capabilities we just couldn't do at all. And
Wow.
what that is, when you put all that together in terms of combined arms warfare, that's when you start to perform the calculations of who's got military power anywhere in the world. And we lacked that in the United States. It's developing now. And since the Ukraine war, those brigades in Russia have gone to Ukraine and have been destroyed. So they're flatlined, and we have this incredible opportunity to close that gap now ourselves.
This is our time to close that gap. Do we have a naval uh, base Nothing? Not even in northern Alaska?
They're working on continued efforts to get the Nome port uh, into a deep water sort of capability. So that's something that's been going on for probably a decade now, where the United States DoD has started to look at what its needs will be to operate in the Arctic. It realized that our furthest north infrastructure that could support maritime operations were Kodiak and Dutch Harbor and Anchorage. And those are,
Way south. Wow.
they still are. And those distances can really impact your capabilities overall. So DoD started to realize, hey, we need another, what's known as a sea line of communication. We have lines of communication on land and sea lines of communication, which are those nodes, those forward nodes of locations and infrastructure that allow you to be able to operate and in further distances, right? So you don't have to come all the way to Anchorage to get logistics or maintenance. You can go a shorter distance and get right back into, the operations. And Nome became that location that was targeted. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on this for many years, and they officially dropped out of that last year, realizing that continued efforts, lack of money, the mission sort of changing, and the government is sort of they're doing that thing. Why do we need anything in the Arctic, right?
Yeah.
There's still that resistance and USAC just pulled out. They're just like, hey, we're done. I think it's very difficult to understand why they did that. I can kind of understand, but I feel like they were signaling that, hey, you know what? This isn't being taken seriously enough. This is being sort of put together in a way that's not really getting at development. So they just pulled out. And I think they're signaling to Congress, like, you've got to get serious and really invest and make this happen. So we haven't seen any movement there yet. I expect it eventually. And I think with what we saw last summer, China and Russia deliberately doing quite a few things in the Arctic as a demonstration. I think that thing I mentioned earlier about not triggering DC into spending, I think we just saw that happen last summer.
Yeah. In this case, they made a mistake. They triggered DC.
I think it was on purpose. They knew this was going to happen,
Oh,
and
you think it was on purpose?
they just had to pick a time when they were willing to. Well, for Russia, it would not be difficult to be present in the Bering Sea so much that we couldn't possibly keep up, and they could just embarrass us with that capability and our lack of capability. So
Mhm.
I think we just saw intent to do so from now on. So
Wow.
I believe our maritime forces are also paying attention and they're going to have to change their op tempo and figure out what to do to be there.
Yeah.
Because that's the requirement. If Russia's
Yeah.
going to be there, we have to be there.
Um, Help me with my geography, Dr. Bouffard. Nome is on the Bering Sea, right? It's not necessarily north of Alaska, it's still sort of west of Alaska.
Yeah, that
Okay.
peninsula on the
Yeah.
west, that big peninsula on the west side of Alaska, right on the southern portion of that peninsula is where
Yeah. Yeah.
it's in a really good location geographically.
Yeah, they should develop that. And Kodiak and Dutch Harbor, they're way south. And for our audience, as I was sharing with you, I have been to Alaska. And even though I literally drove around a very small portion of it, I can attest that Alaska is humongous. It's just gargantuan. So you need something up there. Um, uh, President Trump is interested in uh, gaining territory in Canada and Greenland. We don't know in what form that may happen or if it will happen. I'm not really interested in the politics of it, whether that's a good or bad thing. I'm sure everyone has their opinion. That's fine. We've had other episodes about that. I'm just wondering, are Canada and Greenland would be via Denmark, obviously. Are they sort of militarily prepared? Are they secure in the Arctic?
Canada is prepared for Arctic operations in protection of their sovereign waters and territory. It's not new to them. And in some ways, they're ahead of the United States. Their
Hmm.
Canadian program is phenomenal. And I think there's going to be interest in a similar program for Alaska. Their maritime capabilities are significant, probably ahead of ours or similar, but the to understand that, you just got to understand there's a big difference between the U.S. Coast Guard and the Canadian Coast Guard. U.S. Coast Guard has statutory missions that involve law enforcement. Canadian Coast Guard does not. That is the Royal Canadian Navy. So they have different vessels to do that, but they're quite active and they continue to invest and develop vessels for Arctic operations. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, their military is still relatively small to ours. JTF North in Yellowknife has been helping to lead the way for CJOC and D&D for many years, and they're working closely with us in a lot of ways, the United States, in terms of their series of exercises. Nanook, there's four variants on that, and more you see the United States and Canada is working together operationally, largely because our environments are almost identical. So there's lots of value in working together.
And that work is continuing now, despite the sort of the political rift that's developed in the last 2 months.
Absolutely. As either opportunities or by legal requirement, because NORAD is a binational legal requirement in terms of North American defense. So that's healthy. And on a daily basis, NORAD understands how difficult it is to work in the North, to include what's happening right now geopolitically, and really explains the Greenland issue more than not. In
How so?
Well, North American defense is the epicenter of why most of this is happening. So you know of the DEW line, and I think everyone listening does, of course. And that's a distance early warning system in a missile defense enterprise that stretches from Alaska all the way over to Greenland. And since the Cold War and post-Cold War, that has existed and been maintained and upgraded over the years to deal with the ballistic missile threat. And that involves that legacy threat that is changing now. And our North American defense needs have taken a different route. And this is where the most important national defense and homeland defense has developed from. Those ballistic missiles and the defense systems that are in place to deal with that, that's that. The new threat, hypersonic cruise missiles, that defense system can't do a thing with. Nothing. We have absolutely no defense against hypersonic cruise missiles right now.
That's being developed in China.
China, Russia, United States, adversaries realize this is the threat to get behind and develop. So Russia's led this in terms especially of post-Soviet Russia having to modernize and stand up its military again. It kept the strategic sub forces in good shape, realizing that's the most lethal threat that's going to keep their adversaries sort of at bay, while the rest of the military just degraded into almost nothing. And I saw this firsthand. So when Russia did start to redevelop and modernize its military, one of the first things it did is went right after cruise missile development, and it's operationalized air, land, and sea launch capabilities in the Arctic in multiple variants. So Russia has demonstrated to the world that cruise missiles, hypersonic cruise missiles, are the real deal. Pennies to the dollar, they can really put your adversaries in the corner. So we realize, obviously, that this is the direction the world's going in. And those legacy defense systems in North America will not work for that at all. And that's largely because of ballistic missiles also travel at hypersonic speeds, right? But they go into orbit and then they re-enter, and They are just locked onto a target via gravity. We can detect that. You got ground-based sensors looking up that can detect it. They can identify it through discrimination, and then they can send a response. And those are called ground-based interceptors.
Mhm.
And they fly straight and they just drop via gravity. Okay, we can deal with that. That's what the system is now. However, that's not how hypersonic cruise missiles work, right?
How do
Those
they
can
work?
they launch air, land, or sea and fly very low. In some cases, they don't go into orbit, which means you can't detect them in the conventional ways. And most importantly, they fly at hypersonic plus speeds and they maneuver. So you can't just
They
simply
maneuver?
maneuver.
So
So
they're going in a line and then they can just shift and go like switch course. How do you intercept that?
physically impossible with the current capabilities. So what's going to take are pretty exotic energy weapons to do so. Lasers is the only way. And there's a
Huh.
lot of effort to do that. So
That's enough to keep you awake at night.
it's kept everyone awake at night, current and former commanders at NORAD Northcom. So because the Arctic is still the shortest avenue of approach to attack North America, now we have to look at this North American defense enterprise and figure out what do we need to do to deal with a new threat. And that's been being worked on for at least a decade plus.
Wow.
And it's not easy because what systems we do have that sort of work decently to deal with hypersonic cruise missiles, because you can't look from the ground up, you have to look from space down, are reliant on satellites. And satellites above 60, 65, especially 70 degrees latitude do not work in the Arctic, not well enough to even come close to meeting standards.
Hmm.
So that's really put us in a bind, and that's nothing new. That's been the moment we learned about hypersonics and different threats, the solutions just naturally came pouring out in terms of, all right, satellites, and they don't work here. Lasers don't work here either, right? There's just a lot of problems here in the north and the higher latitudes that prevent those sort of conventional solutions from being options.
Is that because of the curvature of the Earth, or what? Why is that? Why would they not work lasers? And so,
Lasers, they don't work here because largely in the Arctic environment, especially in North America, we have a substantial presence of ice crystals in the air columns. And, you
oh
know,
wow,
in effect, those are tiny little mirrors. So little mirrors, millions of them, and lasers just don't mix, obviously. So there's ways to deal with this,
wow.
other things, but it just starts to add and reveal how difficult it is to do anything that we can kind of do elsewhere in the world in the Arctic. It is just not the same. And I've watched this develop over the years when the Arctic mission sort of developed. And the military is like, okay, hey, let's just send this vehicle or something up to the Arctic, paint it white and call it Arctic. I've seen this with all kinds of stuff, and it has never, ever worked. So the reality is really starting to set in on how difficult it is to operate up here, including at the strategic defense, level. So we've had,
Hmm.
with time, we've been able to deal with those aerial, aid incursions, so that the 10 o'clock position here in Alaska, we've been tested and our defense systems and responses are pretty capable. North Atlantic side, at the 2 o'clock position, North America, same thing, lots of activity, and what's been reestablished there is a clear indication. It's that center sector, the 12 o'clock. It hasn't really been tested of interest that is open for exploitation that we know that Russia was probably starting to look at, and that needs work. And Greenland, with Pituffik Space Base there, is the location to do this. So when we do have to beef up and upgrade strategic defense infrastructure for the entire North American defense enterprise, that center sector is going to become more important than it had in the past. And Greenland, via that space base especially, is the key location.
Oh, wow.
So
And does it have capabilities now, or is this something that need? You're shaking your head no, right?
Nope, not yet. It has some for sure,
Hmm.
but knowing that you have a location from which to, establish that kind of infrastructure that's needed is the first step. We have that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's the start of like, okay, now that we know that we have it, what do we need? And that's going to be part of the entire North American defense, more or less the early warning system for the lower 48, what we call
Hmm.
the lower 48. So,
Yeah. And again, without just getting stuck in the politics of it, we can expand our capabilities in that space, Air Force base, not well, space, space base, I guess you would call it, in Greenland, right?
Space Force space. So
Yeah.
that center sector, that 12 o'clock position, really hadn't been exploited before. Where
Yeah.
we got Russia, doing incursions in a 10 o'clock position, 2 o'clock, hadn't seen it at the 12 o'clock, expecting it along with the, what can be expected as far as the hypersonic cruise missile threat, which can be delivered via air
Yeah. Yeah.
or sea. It's time to close that up. It's time
Yeah.
to upgrade all the systems, but it's really time to put a lot more effort into the center sector also.
Wow. Uh, and just let me ask the question again. We don't have any treaty limitations from to prevent us from further developing that space for base to help with this issue of intercepting hypersonics. We can go and develop it should there be money and the will and technology to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, that's great news. Let's take a break here. Stay with me as Dr. Bouffard and I get into the perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Bouffard, in the last segment, you mentioned NORAD. And I made a sort of a mental note to follow up in this segment about who's like who's governing the Arctic region. The way we were discussing it, one could walk away sort of in semi jest and say, wow, this sounds like the Wild West, but it can't be, and probably it's not. Are there councils, governing bodies over this area?
Yeah, in the past there had been more.
There have been more.
Yeah,
Okay.
with Russia in full invasion of Ukraine has had a really big impact on that in
Hmm.
negative ways too. So the Arctic Five that I mentioned before, with that those sovereign issues to deal with, and bring most of the influence into regional affairs, have had other different outlets to sort of manage something that was rather fascinating. In the past, we talk about the Arctic as being, exceptional. And
Exceptional. Okay.
yeah, except Arctic exceptionalism was part of the lexicon for years. And that was largely because we were experiencing a level of cooperation unlike anywhere else in the world. And with the Arctic Five, who tend to dominate in terms of powers because of sovereign authorities, four of those Arctic Five were Western nations, members of NATO, and the other was Russia. And we were cooperating in ways unlike anywhere else on the planet. And that was really fascinating. And everyone fully committed to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to be the primary instrument from which to deal with issues in the Arctic, since it's 65% maritime, 35% terrestrial, right? Maritime management and instruments, legal treaties and conventions become really important, and none more so than the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So in
Um,
2008, I remember in your notes you had mentioned the Ilulissat Declaration of
yeah, and
2000.
that was in Greenland, right? Okay.
Arctic Five got together in 2008 in response to interesting suggestions that the Arctic should be governed under a Antarctic-like treaty. And
Hmm.
we all knew that was a ridiculous notion. And the Arctic Five realized, okay, before this even becomes a thing, we're going to set the record straight. So all five ministers of foreign affairs went to Ilulissat, signed a declaration that said there will be no such thing. We will deal with all of our sovereign-based issues via commitment and support through the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. It was a loud and clear message. Then came back together in 2010 and 12 to re-sign it. That upset the Arctic Three a little bit because they were, feeling like they're left out. But that was an example of like what it means to have sovereign authority. But the message was loud and clear. There will be no such Antarctic treaty. And the Arctic Five are committed to doing business and dealing with issues in the Arctic, mainly through UNCLOS. If it's got anything sovereign related to the issue, it will be dealt with through UNCLOS.
Through what? You mean through UN?
The UN Convention on Law of the Sea would be
Yeah.
that determines this.
It almost seems like this is my paraphrasing my analysis, Dr. Bouffard. It almost seems like the nation said, "Look, we don't want any overarching treaty. We don't want to set a blueprint. We're going to deal with it case by case basis based on the UN conventional laws of the sea."
Yeah, I mean, Antarctica was a landmass of without sovereignty in any way, shape, or form, surrounded by waters.
Yeah.
And the Arctic is water surrounded by sovereign nations.
Yeah.
So the circumstances are completely different, and UNCLOS was something everyone worked hard to learn about as the Arctic was starting to emerge into this globalized world and what we're facing today, and it's still just as important.
This is a question that we could have a whole podcast. I'm just going to ask it because I'm just wondering if you can respond to it with a brief answer. Are the 8 Arctic nations, or the 5 or the 3, now rushing to sort of expand their territorial waters in the Arctic, sort of pushing it further and further? Is that what's happening, or no? There's not a water grab going on? I'm using water grab versus land grab because it's mostly watery, right?
It happens a little differently. The UN Convention on Law of the Sea is the only treaty or convention in the world that has a mediation device in it. So, and that's Article 76.
Uh-huh.
And that allows for nations, when they become full party members, ratified to UNCLOS.
Mm-hmm.
They have 10 years from that date to submit the definitions of their coastal baselines.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very important boundary that has to be defined, as well as if they wish to have an extension of territory, rights to territory beyond the exclusive economic zone. So that 200 nautical mile EEZ, which is standard for the world, where possible, right? Sometimes there isn't 200 nautical miles, so nations will get together and figure out a good, good split there.
Because the nations are too close to each other, kind of like in the case of Sweden and Finland. I mean, on the Baltic area, anyway.
Russia and Alaska, like so.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So there is a mediation device built into UNCLOS to handle, which is through UNCLOS 1, 2, and 3, a way to pursue an extended continental shelf, it's called, beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And what that allows is, if after submitting a significant amount of evidence, either sedimentary or geological, over many years, and officially applying and stating that you intend to look for that extended continental shelf, if it all works out and nations come to an agreement, sovereign nations are the only ones that can do this, UNCLOS cannot, then you can get an extension of 350 up to 350 nautical miles for rights to access below the seabed only. So up to the EEZ, the member states, nation states have full control over water columns, seabed and below. You got the rights to the fisheries and everything in the water column, seabed and below, not the surface waters, right? That's innocent passage and whatnot, and complicated rules for that. But when you get that extension, after going through the entire process for many, many, many years, you get rights to the below the seabed only, and that's obviously for minerals and
Yeah, yeah.
well, that happens all over the world. It's happening in the Arctic. There's three nations doing it: Russia, Canada, and Denmark via Greenland.
We're not doing it?
We are. I mean, most nations are. We are. And what I mean by those three is this is where things get really interesting politically, geopolitically. Is there are a couple circumstances where you can do this, and you're not really interfering with anyone else's interests. And then there's circumstances where you're requesting this and your interests overlap with someone else's. And in this case, all three overlap right over the
Hmm.
North Pole. And
Wow.
that really starts the story is like generally you when such a request is made is to to go after potentially very valuable minerals or resources, within that extension. In this case, there's not a whole lot in those. And this is where we realized things are taking on a different shape in the Arctic. And the reason why the nations overlap right in that one spot in the Arctic is because it's over the North Pole. And it's become a symbolic goal, which is imagine Russia or any nation being able to say, we own the North Pole, symbolically or otherwise. That is what's going on here.
It's just is sort of to have a laurel for yourself, kind of like accolade. That's what it is.
All it is. All it is.
Oh, that
And
is so interesting.
we all do that. We all do that. We're all working on promoting our Arctic identities as nations. It's a constant, sort of development. And for Russia, like obviously this would be super important for them because that's why they planted that flag at the bottom of the North Pole.
They planted a flag in the bottom of the it,
I
so
got
it's
it
not
wrong.
this so it's not a cloth sort of flag. It's got to be some sort of
It was titanium.
so interesting.
Yeah,
Um, uh, you said this, so I got to ask you this, Dr. Bouffard. I told you that my wife and I really enjoyed driving around Alaska for a couple of weeks on a road trip. I recommend it to people. But one thing that we did see as we were driving around, uh, signs for the North Pole. I forget what it was. This was about 10 years ago. And my wife and I kept on saying, where the heck is the North Pole? Is it in Alaska? It's got to be North Alaska then, as in the water, just based on what you were saying.
yeah.
There's
Well,
actually a town called the North Pole in
there
Alaska, right?
is.
Yeah,
A lot of those signs are, and we see them all over the Arctic and even elsewhere in the world.
yeah,
North Pole, like the actual
exactly.
geographic North Pole up on top of the world is so many miles or kilometers away. But we do have here about 10 miles south of Fairbanks, a town called North Pole.
Okay, so that's what they were referring to.
I'm not sure. Sometimes it's the actual North Pole, sometimes it's the town of North Pole.
All right.
Hmm.
Speaking of Fairbanks, let's talk about your work there. You're involved with several different programs. I read about them and I was very impressed. So, if you have a few minutes, I'd like to ask you about them. I think they're very interesting. One is I'm pronouncing it as CASR, CASR, Center for Arctic Security and Resilience. The other one is U.S. Northcom Defense and Security Orientation, ADSO. And the third one is North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. All three. So you're welcome to discuss in whatever order and however much detail you wish.
Early on, we developed ADSO in response to DoD requesting assistance when U.S. Northern Command, which has three geographic areas of responsibility, North Caribbean, Mexico, and Arctic, when it years ago, when it really wanted to develop its Arctic knowledge and build up its Arctic portfolio, had reached out to its sister geographic command, the European Command, to learn about the Arctic. They started to realize something seemed off.
Hmm.
they contacted us at UAF, my boss and I and a couple of colleagues.
You mean University of Alaska Fairbanks, UAF? Okay.
Correct.
Yes.
And a couple of the directorates, the two stars that lead directorates in the command, had some questions for us because they were
Hmm.
getting information from UCOM that didn't quite make sense, and rightfully so. They talked about operations and how to deal with the Arctic from a UCOM perspective, but that's because on that side of the world, it's a much more permissive operating environment. So all around, for example, because of the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic waters going around um, Norway, entering into the Arctic, almost up to Svalbard, that island, the furthest northern island archipelago in the Arctic, it's ice free all year long. No ice at all. Those warm waters prevent sea ice from developing about halfway across the Kola Peninsula there in Russia. Right. So given that they don't have permafrost except at the highest altitudes in the mountains, but it changes everything about your ability to operate and live in the Arctic. And we can see that from some very basic numbers. So if we just look at the Arctic Circle and north, populations, the number of people that live in each nation above the Arctic Circle, it tells you immediately something is wildly different. So in the United States, above the Arctic Circle, we have about 18,000 people. In Canada, about 16,000 people. In Greenland, about maybe not quite that many. Uh, Iceland, zero. Norway, if you had to guess, how many people do you think live above the Arctic Circle?
I don't know, 50,000, 100,000. I don't know.
440,000.
How
Same,
we're 18,000, they're 440,000?
yes. And similar numbers for Norway and Finland and Sweden, less so for sure. But Norway is a perfect example of what happens when you have no permafrost and you have an ability to develop infrastructure at fairly normal circumstances, prices, and efforts. And I was just in Buda the other week and well above the Arctic Circle in a city that was fully developed with all the normal amenities and roads and railroads and ports and things we do not have in the North American
And
Arctic.
and that's in Norway.
Yep. And that's because of permafrost. You got no sea ice, you got no permafrost. You can build things that last that you cannot do in the North American Arctic. In those demographics, the number of people and populations tells you just from that alone, right? Things are completely different from the European Arctic versus the North American Arctic. And all of that brings an operational capability that you can begin to imagine pretty quickly. So when the European command there in the European Arctic talked about all the things you can do in the Arctic, we're like, you can't do that here. So Northcom became concerned about, okay, we really need to understand this better.
That's what you mean, where the military contacted university, your department is specifically saying something didn't make sense. And that's the disconnect between what Europe is saying, oh, we can do this, we can do this. And US military is looking, no, we can't even build these things because
Right.
of permafrost.
Yeah.
Oh, that is fascinating. So you've worked
All
on that in your university.
Yep, for about 9 years, we ran the program to baseline DoD's knowledge, official knowledge of the Arctic, but across all commands and whatnot, and that went very well. And normally regional centers do that for DoD,
Yeah.
except it hadn't existed for the Arctic until recently. So we managed that for well over 9 years. And, obviously with our backgrounds also, we were able to do the other thing that was really important, which was tell us why that's important operationally. So everything we discussed always had that element too. And for those 9 years, it was just absolutely amazing. It was some of the best times I've had. And it
Wow.
changed, right? I remember the when we started, we had a few people in DoD dealing with the Arctic that, we could barely spell Arctic. And by the time we were done, we had a huge DoD network of knowledge and people, and it's just growing and growing now. And it's really neat to see that.
Do you have departments within UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, on the engineering side that are looking at this?
Yeah, so we were charged with developing a program, and then we relied on our professional connections with all of our world-class scientists and things that we just do here at UAF, to bring that to DoD as a small team, right? Instead of trying to bring, 18 different world-class experts in front of, we just delivered it ourselves, but through development with all of our colleagues who are the foremost experts. So if I had a question about engineering or permafrost, I just went down the road to my colleague's office and we had a discussion,
Yeah.
and we would be able to put it together for presentation, and analysis for DoD in that way. And we did that for 9 years, and it was just fun.
Wow, that's right. Are you still working with the Department of Defense, or has this program come to a
That
halt?
program, that program necessarily normally went to the regional center once it stood up, and that freed me up from not having to work on that particular responsibility anymore, and I could shift focus on things the regional centers don't do, which is research and operations.
Yeah.
And as things grew, and the need for real capabilities and all this stuff was really developing so fast, splitting that responsibility up and being able to focus the way we have has been very helpful.
Um, with the new administration, and also with what happened last summer, you told me in the last segment about flotilla. Well, maybe not a flotilla, just the Chinese and Russian ships going up, and it was sort of an awakening for uh, experts in America. Has your have your programs changed? Are you developing new programs with the U.S. government to conduct research to look into this?
I often do this with U.S. Northcom and UCOM in different ways, or DoD, or the 11th Airborne Division here in Alaska, where I'm generally try to stay on top of the issues to its most recent and current circumstances, and then the best, I think, forecasting and predictions I can possibly do. And still to this day, in a lot of ways, I will reach out to my colleagues throughout DoD to say, hey, I'm seeing something that may be useful to study or spend time on or
Yeah.
send research to. So I try to do that more because that's been really useful. And there's a lot of resources to handle a lot of the analysis and research needs of things now, and things that should be explained. But I found myself in a niche area where I'm so in tune with every tiny little thing happening in the Arctic with the rest of
Yeah.
that I can forecast and see patterns and things. I'm like, I'm seeing something develop. Maybe we should work on this. So I keep trying to do that. That has done. I think that's helped a lot with DoD. My friends in Canada and with NATS, and that network has really paid off in terms of informing the Canadian government and officials.
By NASA, you mean North American or Arctic Defense and Security Network, right?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
started that. We started that because we're like, well, this thing NORAD exists, which is a binational defense agreement. Why don't we have a similar scholarly slash academic version of that?
Oh, that is so cool. Yeah.
We did that, and then we also had to commit to a charter that said we need to actually function and work at the speed of relevance. Because if we do with the normal research thing, it takes a year to 2 years to get anything out. That doesn't really help in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we committed to working at blistering speeds to help
Love
provide
that.
and inform decision makers as fast as humanly possible, which is it's exciting, but it also comes with the risk of getting it wrong. So we really work hard to work quickly, but we also got to keep ourselves in check a little bit. But it's so far it has been phenomenal. We've had some.
That sounds fabulous. And this is with your Canadian colleagues. Do you have any other
Yeah,
nationalities in there? Let's say people from Denmark or any other place?
we will reach out to our colleagues for sure, but a
Mm,
lot of what we do, this network is meant to make sure we know our North American issues
Canadian,
extremely
American,
well,
yeah.
and
Uh,
then we will do the comparative thing with our European colleagues all the time.
have you ever been called to testify before Congress about these issues?
Not yet. I have, but it's been canceled because it's always the agenda is a bit flaky. So,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
we have our friends in DC, like at the Wilson Center and other places, who are right there and able to do so.
Of course, the Wilson Center. Yeah. Wow, this
Yeah.
is fascinating. Um, Dr. Bouffard, if you wanted our audience to remember just one point about Arctic security after everything we talked about, what would that one point be?
While we prefer to work under circumstances that are proactive in the Arctic, we must never forget that we've got to be prepared for certain things, especially military and or civil security. So we must avoid that temptation to wait for things to blow up or a forcing event, to employ that hindsight. And we have a unique opportunity here before the first significant disaster or crisis hits the Arctic. Let's try to keep in front of this stuff. This
Yeah,
is the best chance to do this on the planet in
that's
history.
wonderful to create some sort of American military supremacy in that area to sort of preemptively avoid these things from happening. Do you think there's ever a chance of having sort of a, I don't know military terms in that sense, sort of like a Arctic division or Arctic sort of military segment to deal with that area?
Yeah, we have that here. So 3 years ago, the 11th Airborne reestablished and was the first unit in U.S. military history to have an Arctic designation.
Oh,
And
wow.
we are still
Awesome.
waiting for the official Arctic mission statement to be released, but unprecedented things are happening already.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Bouffard, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Dr. Bouffard.
Thank you. Have a great time.
Same here.